So, you want to make great videos.
Duh.
But if your footage ever comes out too light or too dark, then that's gotta be cramping your style big time. Maybe you've sat behind your camera like, how come my eyeballs are seeing this and my camera is showing me something totally different? And maybe you've thought to yourself, I bet there are some dials or buttons I could be pressing to fix this situation, but you don't feel comfortable doing that.
Nope.
The problem is that if you want an important job like exposure done right, then you can't outsource that to your camera. You gotta be a boss and control the situation in manual mode, especially because when it comes to video, exposure can be a straight up deal breaker. Not only do shots with wrong exposure just look wrong, but they cause you to lose all sorts of details in your shot. I mean, just look at how much more detail the shot with the correct exposure has in the middle compared to the other two shots on the left and right with the wrong exposure. And once you record a footage with exposure that's too far off the mark, there's no way to recover those details. They are lost forever.
Forever, 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 ever, forever, ever.
That's right, Andre 3000, which is why in this video, I'm gonna be helping you become friends with your camera's manual mode and master those settings that control exposure so that you can record footage that is on point. All right, let's go. Hey y'all, it's Mary Betsy of marybetsy.com, and in this video, we are talking about exposure. So first, let's talk about what is exposure. Well, if you saw another lesson of mine on frame rates, then you might remember when I talked about your camera's sensor. And if you haven't seen that, then you can watch it at the link on the bottom of the screen. But basically, inside your camera, there's this thing called a sensor. And every time the sensor is exposed to the light of the world, it records information about what it's seeing and it takes a picture. How does it do that? I don't know. That's some physics mess that I don't understand and you don't need to either. But just trust me, every time your sensor is exposed to the light, it takes a picture. Now, the amount of light that your camera's sensor is exposed to is called exposure. And that affects how light or how dark the picture is that your sensor takes, or how light or dark is each frame of your video. If your sensor is underexposed to light, your footage is gonna be too dark. And if it's overexposed, it's gonna be too light. So how do you control exposure? Well, you could, of course, increase the amount of light that's coming from the light sources in your environment, or you could use your camera to control the exposure, and that's what we're going to cover in this video. But first, you're going to want to switch your camera over to manual mode so that you have full control. Now, if your camera also takes photos in addition to video, then oftentimes the manual mode setting for photos is in a different spot than for video. For photos, a lot of times it's at the top right dial, but for video, it might be buried in a menu, so check your user manual so you can switch that baby over to manual mode. Now that you're in the driver's seat, let's talk about the 4 ways that you can control exposure with your camera. And they are shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and ND filters. Now we're gonna break down each of these in just a second, but first, it's important to remember that you can mix different combinations of these 4 factors and still have the same exposure or have the same amount of light in your shot. So all of these shots have the same brightness, but we change these 4 factors in different ways to get to the same exposure. But you may notice that there's still differences between them. Like you see how much more in focus the word Sony is in that middle shot than the shots on the left and the right. Or look at how this black area on the left shot looks almost dusty compared to that same area in the middle shot. And that's because each of these 4 factors not only affects exposure, but it also affects something else about our shots. And that is how you're going to decide which of these factors to adjust to get the right exposure. Okay, let's dive in. So the first factor that affects exposure is shutter speed. And we're going to flash back again to my earlier lesson on frame rates, which is where I first told you about the camera's shutter. And it's like a giant eyelid that opens and closes over the sensor. Every time the shutter's closed, your sensor sees nothing. And every time the shutter's open, your sensor gets to see the world and take a picture of it. So shutter speed then is how fast the shutter opens and closes, and it affects how long your sensor is exposed to light. A slow shutter speed means that the sensor is exposed to light for more time, and so it means a brighter exposure. And a fast shutter speed means the sensor is exposed to light for less time, and so it means a darker exposure. Now, shutters normally move at very fast speeds. We're talking fractions of a second, and that is how they are measured. So a shutter speed of 1/250 means the shutter opened for 1/250th of a second. That also means that as the number on the bottom of the fraction gets bigger, the shutter speed will get faster and your shot is going to get darker. And you can see that as I speed up the shutter speed for this shot, it's getting darker. All right, so that's how shutter speed controls exposure. But the other thing it controls is motion blur. So it affects how blurry or how sharp the motion in your footage is going to look. That's because the slower the shutter speed, the longer the shutter stays open, and the more time the sensor has to record motion onto each frame of your footage. Let me explain. So let's say it takes Miles 1 second to move his hand from side to side. If I'm filming him and I set my shutter speed to be really slow, like 1/5 of a second, then the shutter is going to stay open for 1/5 of a second every time the sensor records a frame. And 1/5 of a second is like an eternity when it comes to shutter speeds. Because in 1/5 of a second, Miles' hand would have already moved from here to here. And the camera is recording a frame the entire time. And that means that the final frame is going to look really blurry. And the final video will look like this. But let's say I set the shutter speed to be something really fast, like only 1/2000th of a second. In that amount of time, Miles' hand would have barely moved. So the image would look like this, like the motion is frozen. And the video will end up looking like this. So a slower shutter speed means more blur, and a faster shutter speed means less blur. So you can see that as I slow down the shutter speed here, it not only creates a lighter exposure, but the motion is also getting blurrier. And that is how shutter speed works, and that is the first factor in controlling your exposure. Factor number 2 in controlling your exposure is aperture. So what is aperture? Well, aperture is this little hole that you can see if you look at the end of your lens. And when you adjust your aperture, this hole gets bigger or smaller, which obviously affects how much light your sensor is exposed to. And the larger this opening is, the more light your sensor is exposed to, and then the brighter your shot is. Now, aperture is measured in f-numbers, also known as f-stops, and I don't know what fool came up with this system, but I'm gonna warn you, it's a little whack. Because the bigger the opening, the lower the f-number, and the more light gets into your shot, and I don't know about you, but I'm already confused. And so when it comes to aperture, just forget everything I said about that little opening, and remember this instead. The lower the f-number, the lighter your shot. Lower, lighter. So you can see here that as the f-number gets lower, the shot gets lighter. And if you forget this, then don't stress. You can just turn the wheel on your camera for aperture and see that if I turn it to the left, my shot is getting lighter. So that is how aperture controls exposure, but what else does it control about your shot? Well, you may remember from the lesson on cinematic shots that aperture also controls how much is in focus in your shot. So if you use an aperture with a lower f-number, like f2, then you're going to have less stuff in focus in your shot. So here only the S in Sony is in focus and everything else is blurry. But if you use an aperture with a higher f-number, like f16, then you're going to have more in focus in your shot. So here the whole camera is in focus and we can see all these details in the background that were just blurry at f2. So higher f-numbers, like f8 to f16, are great for landscapes because you want deep distances to be in focus in your shot. You want everything from that rock in front all the way to that mountain in the back to stay in focus. But because I'm usually filming people, I almost always use an aperture with a really low f-number, like f2 to maybe f4, because that's going to blur my background and it's going to make my subjects stand out. But to recap about aperture, a lower f-number means a lighter exposure with less in focus. Factor number 3 in controlling exposure is ISO. So ISO measures how sensitive is your camera to light. So when the ISO is high, the camera is going to be super sensitive to light and it's going to suck up as much light in the scene as it can and translate that light into the pixels on your video footage. But as the ISO gets lower, the camera reacts less to light in the scene, so your footage looks less bright. So if you're filming in a low light environment, you might want to use a higher ISO and it's going to make a huge difference in what you can see in your shot. So here I am filming at night and this is what I am seeing with my eyes. It's really dark, but this is what the camera is seeing at a really high ISO of 32,000. And it's almost like the camera has these magic powers to see in the dark. All of this magic, though, doesn't come for free because when you increase your ISO, you're also increasing the electrical signal that your camera is sending to the sensor, and that creates noise or grain on your image. So if you've ever seen one of them old school TVs lose its signal and you see that snow, that is what noise is. And so on top of affecting exposure, ISO also affects noise. So the lowest ISO setting is 100, and that is when you're gonna have the least noise and the highest quality image, which is why I always use ISO 100 if I'm filming with a lot of light, like if I'm filming outdoors in sunlight. But as you increase the ISO, you're also going to increase the noise in your shot. Now, my Sony a7S II is doing a good job keeping that noise at a minimum, even as the ISO gets really high. But if we zoom in, then you can see how much cleaner the image is at the low ISO of 100 on the left, than the shot on the right at ISO 6400 that's got all that noise. Now, the amount of noise that you're gonna see at these high ISOs is gonna depend on what kind of camera you're using. So my full frame Sony a7S II on the left is gonna have less noise than my Canon G7X pocket camera on the right, even though these shots are at the same ISO. All right, so to recap about ISO, remember that the higher your ISO, the brighter your exposure, and the more noise your shot will have. The fourth and final factor that affects your exposure is ND filters. So an ND filter, aka a neutral density filter, is this thin round piece of glass that screws on to the end of your lens. And it does the same thing for your camera that sunglasses do for your eyes. It filters the amount of light that your camera sees, and that darkens your exposure. And just like you often use sunglasses when you're in the sun, you often use an ND filter when you're in the sun too. But besides affecting your exposure, the other thing that ND filters can affect is that they can lower your shooting flexibility a little bit. And that's because screwing a filter onto the end of your lens is just not as fast as turning a dial on your camera. But that's not usually a huge problem because you're usually filming in a bright location for a while, so you can just pop a filter on and leave it there for a minute. Plus, they also have magnetic adapters and this other adapter that has a little hinge on it that was recently crowdfunded on Kickstarter that can make putting on an ND filter even easier. All right, so that is ND filters, and that is the last factor that affects your exposure. We've been through all four of them now, but that was like a lot of information, so let's recap for a sec. So these are the 4 ways that you can use your camera to control your exposure or to control how light or dark your shot is. Factor number 1 is shutter speed, which also affects motion blur. Factor number 2 is aperture, which also affects how much is in focus in your shot. Factor number 3 is ISO, which also affects how much noise is in your shot. And factor number 4 is ND filters, which can also affect your shooting flexibility. And remember that you can mix these 4 factors in different ways and still get at the same exposure. All right, so those are the ways that you can control exposure, and that concludes this video. But I've got 2 more videos about exposure coming up next. The next one, I'm going to take you behind the scenes and show you how I adjust these factors in different shooting scenarios to get the right exposure. And then the one after that, I'm going to cover all the types of tools that you have inside your camera and inside monitors to measure exposure. And there are a lot of cool ones. So if you're interested in that, then click the subscribe button and the notification bell below, and you'll get a heads up when those are out. All right, I hope you found these helpful, and if you have any questions at all, then please leave me a comment below. I read them all, I answer them all. I'd really love to hear from you. And yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye, y'all.